I was sitting on the back porch of a house I didn't own yet, drinking coffee I'd made wrong because I still hadn't figured out the espresso machine, watching the sun come up over the hills outside of Medellin, and I felt, for the first time in maybe 20 years, like I could breathe. Back home, my ex-wife was probably already on her second argument of the morning. That was her gift. She could fight before breakfast. I want to tell you how I got here, not the airplane version. The real version. Because it didn't start with a plane ticket. It started with a credit card statement I wasn't supposed to see. My name is not important. What's important is that I spent 31 years being a husband who tried. I was an electrical engineer, mid-level management, decent salary. Not rich, but solid. We had a 4-bedroom house in a suburb outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. We had 2 cars. We had a son who was 26 by the time the story ends, and a daughter who was 23. My wife. I'll call her my ex-wife now because that's what she is. I'll call her my ex-wife now because that's what she is. Her name was Serena. We met when I was 29. She was beautiful and funny, and she made me feel like the most interesting man in any room. I should have noticed that the feeling only lasted as long as I was useful to her. But I was 29, and she was beautiful. So I didn't notice much. For the first decade, things were fine. We weren't passionate, but we were stable. She worked as a real estate agent. I brought home the larger paycheck. We split things fairly, or so I thought. Then her business started doing well. Really well. And something shifted. The better she did, the smaller she made me feel. It was subtle at first. A comment here, a look there. When I talk about my work at dinner, she'd redirect the conversation within 2 minutes. When I got a promotion, a real one, with a raise, she said, "That's nice, honey," the same way you'd respond to a child showing you a drawing. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was just how marriages go after a while. I told myself a lot of things to avoid looking at what was actually happening. What was actually happening was that my wife had been, for at least 3 years before I found out, siphoning money from our joint account into one I didn't know existed. Not a little money. A lot of money. I found the statement by accident. I was looking for a utility bill. We'd had a dispute with the power company, and I opened the wrong envelope. The account had $47,000 in it. The deposits went back to 2019. Regular. Methodical. Like she'd been planning something. I didn't confront her that night. I'm not a man who acts before he thinks. I sat with it for 4 days. I pulled our credit reports. I went through the joint account history going back 5 years. I found a pattern I can only describe as architectural. She had built a financial exit strategy while I was still paying the mortgage and coaching our son's little league team on weekends. When I finally sat down with her, she didn't deny it. She said she was protecting herself. I asked her from what. She didn't answer. I asked her if she was leaving. She said she didn't know yet. She said she needed space to think. That was a Wednesday. By the following Monday, she had moved into the guest room. By the end of that month, she had a lawyer. The divorce took 11 months. I won't bore you with all of it. What I'll tell you is the part that nearly broke me. My son. I'll call him my son because that's all he is to me. Whatever else he became during those months, he was 24 at the time. He was working in finance in Raleigh. He'd always been closer to his mother. I understood that. Some kids are. What I didn't understand was the phone call I got 3 weeks after Serena filed. He called me on a Tuesday evening. I was eating takeout alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous. He said, "Dad, I just want you to know that I'm supporting Mom through this." I said, "I understand, son. This is hard on everyone." He said, "She told me what happened. About how you were never really there for her." I put my fork down. I said, "What exactly did she tell you?" He said she told him I had been emotionally unavailable for years, that I'd prioritized my career over the family, that she'd been unhappy for a long time and I'd refused to see it. There was not one word about the $47,000. I started to explain. He cut me off. He said, "Dad, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to be in the middle." And then he said something I've thought about almost every day since. He said, "She found someone who actually sees her. He's successful. He treats her like she matters. I'm happy for her, Dad. I think you should think about what kind of husband you actually were." He hung up. I sat in that kitchen for 2 hours without moving. The man she had found was named Philip. He was a developer. Real estate, high-end residential. He and Serena had apparently met at a conference 18 months before I found that bank statement. I'll let you do that math. He was 58. Serena was 53. He drove a car that cost more than I made in a year and lived in a neighborhood where the houses didn't have mailboxes because everything was managed by a concierge service. My daughter called me the week I found out about him. She was the one who told me. She was also the one who apologized for telling me, which told me everything I needed to know about how that family phone tree worked. She said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said, "I will be." She said, "Mom's moving fast." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't agree with any of this. I need you to know that." She was the one person in my immediate family who said that to me directly. I've never forgotten it. The divorce was finalized in March. We sold the house. After everything was split, mortgage balance, accounts, retirement funds divided by the court, I walked away with $214,000. Not nothing, but not what 31 years of two incomes should have produced either. I spent 2 months in a studio apartment in Charlotte trying to figure out what I was doing next. I was 61 years old, recently divorced, sitting in a furnished apartment that smelled like other people's dinners, watching financial planning videos on YouTube at midnight. One night, I fell down a rabbit hole. People talking about retiring abroad, stretching a fixed income. Colombia came up over and over. Specifically, Medellin. The climate, the cost of living, the infrastructure improvements, the expat community that had grown there in the last decade. I want to be honest with you. My first reaction was that it was not for me. I had never lived outside of North Carolina except for 2 years after college. I was not a traveler. I did not speak Spanish. But I kept watching, and something in me, the part that had spent 31 years being reasonable, being practical, being the person who stayed, that part said, "Why not?" So I booked a 2-week visit. I told myself it was just research. I never came back. Medellin in person is not what most Americans imagine. The city climbs up hillsides in ways that don't make sense until you're in it. And then suddenly they make all the sense in the world. There are flowers everywhere, bougainvillea spilling off balconies, birds of paradise in median strips. The weather is what they call eternal spring, 68 degrees, every day. My monthly expenses were $2,600. That included a 2-bedroom apartment with a view of the valley, a cleaning service twice a week, restaurant meals 4 nights out of 7, a Spanish tutor 3 hours a week, and more fresh fruit than I'd eaten in the previous decade combined. In Charlotte, I'd been spending $4,800 a month on less. I found a language exchange partner at a coffee shop in El Poblado, a retired professor in his late 60s, incredibly patient with my accent, who insisted on practicing his English at the same time. We spent 2 hours every Thursday morning correcting each other's grammar and arguing about baseball. He became one of the best friends I've had in my adult life. I found a church with an English language service on Sunday mornings. I started hiking with a group on Saturday afternoons. I got a SIM card, learned to use the metro, stopped being afraid of ordering food in Spanish. I was building something. Quietly, without anyone watching. 8 months after I settled in Medellin, my daughter called me with news I had been expecting but still wasn't ready for. Serena and Philip were engaged. The wedding was scheduled for October, in Asheville. A vineyard venue. My daughter told me this carefully. The way you tell someone something that might hurt them, watching their face even over a phone call. I said, "Thank you for telling me." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Honestly, yes." I meant it. The grief had moved through me by then. What I felt was more like watching a news story about someone you used to know. Distant, observable. Then she told me the other part. My son was going to be in the wedding party. I said, as a guest. She paused. Then she said, as a groomsman. I thanked her and ended the call and sat on my porch for a long time without saying anything. The valley was lit up below me. The city hummed. I thought about the phone call my son had made to me 14 months earlier. He treats her like she matters. I thought about what it meant that my son would stand beside the man who had helped dismantle my marriage in a rented suit, smiling for photographs. I chose not to call him. I had nothing to say that would help either of us. The wedding happened on a Saturday. I know this because my daughter texted me that morning. Just a brief message, something like, "Thinking of you today, Dad." I was at a farmer's market in Laurels, buying tomatoes and arguing gently with the vendor about the price of avocados. It was, objectively, a good morning. The news came from a man I'll call my old colleague, someone I'd worked with for 12 years, who had stayed loosely in touch through all of it. He wasn't at the wedding, but he knew someone who was, and that person, bless their discretion-free heart, had already started posting to social media before the reception was halfway over. What happened was this. Philip had given a speech. A long one, apparently, the kind of speech that makes everyone at a wedding slightly uncomfortable, because it goes on 4 minutes past when it should have ended. He talked about finding Serena, about recognizing a woman who had been, in his words, overlooked and undervalued by the people who should have seen her. One of the guests, a woman, older, someone who had known Serena since before I did, stood up during the toast portion of the reception and raised her glass. And she said, loud enough for several tables to hear, "To Serena, who I hope this time around has been honest about where the money comes from." That was it. That was the whole sentence. I'm told the room went very quiet. I'm told Serena set her champagne glass down and did not pick it up again for a long time. I'm told Philip asked someone near him what that meant, and no one answered him. See, this woman, this guest, this old friend, she had known about the account. She had been the one Serena had confided in during the first year of the plan, and somewhere between then and the wedding day, she had decided that standing in a vineyard, watching a woman celebrate a new beginning built on a foundation she'd never disclosed, was more than she could quietly toast. She wasn't being cruel. She was being a witness. Serena called me that same evening. I was eating dinner alone on my porch, a glass of local red in my hand, watching the lights of the city come on as the sun dropped behind the hills. My phone lit up with her name, and I stared at it for 2 full rings before I answered. She was crying before she spoke. She said, "I need to talk to you." I said, "What can I do for you, Serena?" She said she needed me to understand. She said things had gotten complicated. She said Philip had questions, her word, after the reception. She said she had tried to explain, but it was all coming out wrong, and she just needed someone who knew her, someone who understood the whole picture. I sat there listening to her breathe between sentences. I thought about the Wednesday night I'd found that bank statement. I thought about sitting in the kitchen for 2 hours after my son hung up on me. I thought about the studio apartment that smelled like other people's dinners. I thought about the espresso machine I still hadn't figured out when I first got here, and the professor who taught me that the word for patience in Spanish and in life is the same word. I said, "Serena, I don't think I'm the person you should be calling." She said, "I just need," I said. "I know what you need. I spent 31 years trying to give it to you. I think you're going to have to figure this one out on your own." And I ended the call. I sat there for another hour. The city kept humming. The lights kept coming on, one by one, across the valley. I refilled my glass. I was not happy that she was hurting. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a man who takes pleasure in other people's pain, even people who have caused me their own fair share of it. But I was not going to fold myself back into being her resource. Not that night, not ever again. The call from my son came 3 weeks later. I almost didn't answer that one either. He said, "Dad?" Just that. And then a long pause. I said, "I'm here." He said he'd found out. Not everything. He said he was still putting the pieces together, but enough. He'd been talking to his sister. He'd started asking questions that his mother hadn't answered cleanly. He'd done what I had done. 14 months earlier, he'd gone looking, and he'd found things. He said, "Dad, I said things to you that I—" And then he stopped. I could hear him working through something. I didn't have the whole picture. I said, "No, you didn't." He said, "I'm sorry." 2 words. But he meant them. I know my son's voice. I know when he's performing and I know when he's real. That was real. I said, "I appreciate that. Truly." He said, "Are you okay down there? Like, actually okay?" I said, "I'm better than okay. I'm learning Spanish. I have a friend who argues with me about the 1994 World Series every Thursday. I wake up and it's 70 degrees and I eat mango for breakfast. I'm doing all right." He laughed. A real laugh. First time I'd heard that in a long time. He said, "Can I come visit?" I said, "Book the ticket. I'll pick you up." He came in February. Stayed for 10 days. I showed him the city, the metro, the transformation murals in the hillside neighborhoods, the food markets, the botanical gardens. I took him to meet the professor, who immediately began correcting his grammar with great enthusiasm. My son laughed the whole time. On the last night, we sat on the porch the way I sit out there alone most evenings, and he asked me how I had done it, how I had just left. I told him the truth. I told him I hadn't planned it. I told him I found myself at 61 with nothing that looked like the life I'd expected, and I had 2 choices. I could sit in Charlotte grieving a version of myself that no longer existed, or I could go find out what the next chapter actually looked like. He said, "Weren't you scared?" I said, "Every day for the first 3 months." And then one morning I wasn't. He was quiet for a minute. Then he said, "I think I've been living the way I thought I was supposed to live. You know, like following a script." I said, "Most people are. The question is when you figure it out." He left the next morning. We hugged at the curb outside the airport, and he held on for a beat longer than he usually does. And I let him, and I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that needed saying. It has now been 2 years since I arrived in Medellin. My Spanish is functional, not fluent, but I can have a full conversation, negotiate a lease, understand the news, tell a joke that lands maybe 60% of the time. I joined a small investment group made up of expats and local professionals. I've been consulting part-time for a construction firm that wants to expand into the U.S. market. Turns out 31 years of electrical engineering has international value, even when you're no longer trying to prove anything to anyone. I hear occasional updates about Serena through my daughter. She and Philip are still married. The questions that came up at the wedding did not, apparently, end the relationship, though my daughter says things are different between them. Quieter. More careful. That's all I know and all I need to know. My daughter visited me last spring with her boyfriend. They stayed 2 weeks and fell in love with the city. She told me, and this is the part I think about most, that watching me here made her realize she'd always thought of her father as a man who stayed put. And now she had to revise that. She said she thought it was good. She said it made her feel like things could still change. I told her that was the whole lesson, because here's what I know. At 63, sitting on a porch with decent coffee and a view that still surprises me every morning, I spent 3 decades being a man who stayed quiet, contributed his share, and assumed that stability was the same thing as being seen. It isn't. Stability can become invisibility if you're not careful, and invisibility makes it very easy for the people around you to start planning around you instead of with you. I do not hate Serena. I don't have the energy for that, and I never did. But I understand now that I was living in a story she had already quietly written me out of. I just hadn't read the ending yet. When I finally did read it, I had 2 choices. I could fight for a chapter that was already closed, or I could start a new book entirely. I chose the book, and I'm telling you, I am only on page 40 or so. And it is already better than anything I expected. If there's a person listening to this right now who is sitting in a city that stopped feeling like home, in a life that stopped fitting, wondering if it's too late, I want you to hear me clearly. It is not too late. It is not even close to too late. The only real question is whether you're willing to believe that before someone else's choices force you to find out the hard way. I figured it out the hard way. I still figured it out, and I wake up every morning to 70 degrees and mango and a view of a valley full of lights, and I am, without question, without performance, without anyone watching, at peace. That's the whole story. That's all of it. Thank you for being here with me tonight. I've had a lot of time to sit with this story. Medellin gives you that, long evenings, a quiet porch, a view wide enough that your thoughts don't bounce off the walls and come back at you distorted. And what I keep coming back to is this: nothing that happened to me was random, not the bank account I found by accident, not the phone call from my son that felt like a door slamming, not the one sentence an old friend said at a wedding that I wasn't even at, in a vineyard I'll never visit that somehow reached me anyway. Every one of those things was the result of choices, not fate, not luck. Choices, made by people who believed they wouldn't have to account for them. Serena made a choice, over a long period of time, to build a life in secret while living a shared one. That didn't happen because she was evil. I want to be careful here because easy villains make for satisfying stories, but they don't teach you anything useful. She made those choices because somewhere along the way, she decided that honesty was too costly and that I wouldn't notice. Both of those calculations turned out to be wrong. That's not karma in any mystical sense. That's just what happens when you build something on a foundation you've hidden from the person standing next to you. Eventually, someone sees the ground beneath your feet. My son made a choice too. He chose the version of the story that was handed to him without asking whether there was another one. I understand that. He was 24 and he loved his mother, and it's easier to believe a clean narrative than to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. But choices made on incomplete information tend to require correction later. His correction came when he started asking questions, and the answers didn't line up. That cost him something. I watched it cost him something on that porch in February when he sat beside me and was quiet for a long time before he spoke. What I learned, what I am still learning, is that integrity is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't win arguments in the moment or get the last word at the dinner table. It just stays consistent while everything else moves around it. For 31 years I was, I think, a man of reasonable integrity. I paid what I owed. I showed up. I didn't run, and for a long time, that felt like it wasn't enough, because the person I was doing it for had already decided it wasn't. But integrity isn't transactional. That's the thing I had to learn the hard way. You don't practice it to be rewarded. You practice it because it's the only version of yourself you can live with when the other versions fall away. And then there's the question of courage. The quiet kind, not the loud kind. The courage to leave a city you've lived in your whole life, to book a flight to a country where you don't speak the language yet, to sit with 61 years of everything you thought you knew about yourself and ask honestly, who am I when none of this context exists anymore? That question terrified me. It also saved me. If you are listening to this and you are somewhere you have outgrown, a relationship, a city, a version of yourself that no longer fits, I want you to know that the fear you feel about leaving is real, and it is also not a reason to stay. Fear and danger are not the same thing. One of them is a signal worth heeding. The other is just your nervous system running old software. I am 63. I eat mango for breakfast. I argue about baseball in 2 languages. I wake up and the air is 70 degrees and the valley below me is full of lights, and I am, without performance, without an audience, genuinely at peace. That didn't happen to me. I built it. one honest choice at a time.